understanding that when we talk about believing, that it can befall us in two places. I believe I can believe in the spiritual place of me, and I can believe in my natural mind.
That's
And
good.
so when we start dealing with the placebo effect, the focal point is more on the mind once again, and it's more on the physiological. But when we start talking about faith, it's more in the biblical sense of putting our trust in God, his power, his promises, which leads to a spiritual transformation.
They say what you praying for. Jesus, he's our present hope.
This is Everyday Preachers answering everyday questions. Right back at you. How about we look at Miss Lorena? All right, Miss Lorena. She said, is the placebo effect a type of faith? Is it possible to bring desire? I'm not quite sure the latter what that exactly means, but let me deal with that just a little bit. Um, that's a very interesting question, by the way. Very interesting question. The placebo effect is similar to faith. It is. Um, the main difference would be that the placebo effect focuses more on psychological and physiological responses, while when we talk about faith, it focuses more on the power of God and it's more from the spiritual side of things. A placebo effect can hold a temporary effect, while believing in God by faith holds a permanent or even maybe an eternal effect. A couple of things we see in Mark 5:34, we see some examples of faith when he says, then Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and free of your affliction. Matthew 21:22, he says, whatever you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. Understanding that when we talk about believing, that it can befall us in two places. I believe I can believe in the spiritual place of me, and I can believe in my natural mind.
That's good.
And so when we start dealing with the placebo effect, the focal point is more on the mind once again, and it's more on the physiological. But when we start talking about faith, it's more in the biblical sense of putting our trust in God, his power, his promises, which leads to a spiritual transformation. I do not believe that the placebo effect can lead to a spiritual transformation. I do believe that it can lead to a psychological or even a physiological transformation, but not a spiritual. So the way I would probably separate those, Miss Lorena, would be dealing with faith will operate from the spiritual dimension of a man, and dealing with the placebo effect operates from the second dimensional man. So faith operates in the first dimension, which is spiritual, and placebo effect operates in the second dimension, which is the soul, mind, will, intellect, emotions. In this case, I'm putting emphasis on mainly the mind, the mind of a man. So that's why I would differentiate it. I think that it is it does pattern itself, but it does not have the same effect overall. You can go, like you can go back with the placebo effect, but you can't go back with faith, if that makes sense. And I'm not quite sure when you say, is it possible to bring desire? I'm not sure if you're speaking of the placebo effect, possible to bring desire, or faith. But faith definitely brings desire, if that is the question.
Wow.
And if you're speaking of the placebo effect, I believe that it can bring desire to the mind, but not desire to the spirit.
They say what you praying for.